All right, welcome everyone to this week's Physics Meets ML. We're very happy to have Lukas Heinrich here this week. Lukas is currently at the Technical University in Munich, but also associated with the Max Planck Institute of Physics in Munich. Before joining Munich, he spent several years at CERN, and before that he did his PhD at NYU. And so Lukas is expert in experimental particle physics, and he's a member of the Atlas collaboration. And in particular, using a lot of smart ways of dealing with whatever we observe there and how we interpret it. And in particular, one thing he will tell us today is about how we can make things smarter using differentiable programming. And so we're very much looking forward to your talk, Lukas. So please take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation. So it's one of the great physics and machine learning seminar series. So I'm really happy to be here. Yes, I wasn't sure exactly what the audience is, so it's kind of mixed between. So I was hoping that there's already a bit of machine learning background, which I think is safe to assume. But yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about differentiable programming and Heinrich physics and kind of what gradients can do for us, or at least what questions we're thinking about, because I think it's a fairly new field and we're still figuring out kind of what's going on. And so, yeah, Sven was saying, yeah, so the context of this is kind of my work at the Large Hadron Collider. So here you see a nice picture of the CERN campus and where the Hadron Collider is. It's a large particle accelerator where we're colliding protons at very high energies, and we're hoping to find something new. And yeah, so basically our core mission here is, what we do in science in general is that we want to somehow learn something about the state of nature given the data that we have. And so usually in our community, we're splitting this work kind of two ways. So there are the people like Sven who are, experts in theory, and, they tell us maybe which theories are particularly, probable or, viable. And then, people like me as experimentalists, it's our job to kind of figure out, okay, what would the theory predict in terms of what we observe in the detector, and then we would invert this using, for example, Bayes' theorem to tell us, okay, given the data that we actually do observe, what does this tell us about the remaining set of viable theories? Okay, so that's a very kind of straightforward formula, and so you might ask yourself, okay, so first of all, there's no differentiable programming in here. There's also no machine learning in here, so it's that seems straightforward enough. And so what is really the problem, and why don't we just do this simple formula, and why aren't we done? And but before we get to this, I wanted to just kind of, for those people that are not super familiar with particle physics, just kind of flash three kind of key fundamental questions that we're trying to answer kind of in this way, using the data that we're taking at the Large Hadron Collider. So one of the big questions is that we know, that's only a small fraction of the energy content of the universe is actually matter that we observe, and most of it is actually dark energy, and then a very large fraction is dark matter. And so we know from astrophysical observations that dark matter should exist. And so one of the questions that we are asking at the LHC is whether or not we can create dark matter in the lab. And then you might have heard about the discovery of the Higgs boson a couple of years ago, actually almost exactly 10 years ago. And so this was really a breakthrough moment in particle physics, and it kind of explains the origins of mass and something called symmetry breaking. And this is kind of the core of what our physics program here at the LHC is. Now that we discovered this particle, we are really interested in measuring it in detail. And then there's a lot of questions about why there's so much matter in the universe and so little antimatter. And so there are other experiments at the LHC that are kind of focusing on that as well. Okay, so basically, so why don't we just do this simple formula? Really, the key problem is in this term that is kind of circled in blue. It's this term called the likelihood. It's basically the probability of observing a particular set of data given some theory parameter. And really the problem is that we cannot compute this, and this completely blocks us in a way from just applying standard statistics. And so I'm going to explain this a little bit because it's kind of the core why machine learning is applicable and really well aligned with high energy physics. And so really the problem of why we cannot compute this likelihood is really because kind of the distance between theory and experimental data is very large, and it's this distance is large in multiple respects. So it's large in terms of energy scales, and then it's also large in like a large gap in terms of data dimensionality. And so in terms of energy scale, so Sven is working on energy scales like the Planck scale, which is even beyond what I'm allowed to dream about. But really the physics that we're interested in happens at very, very high energies. But then the physics that we're actually observing in terms of the interactions of particles with our sensors is at many orders of magnitudes lower energy. And so we need to somehow bridge this gap. And so I just want to walk through kind of how we are bridging this gap. And so we start at very high energies, maybe at the Planck scale, and then we compute what a particular theory at the Planck scale would imply in terms of the energy scales that we're probing at the LHC. And so there we can compute kind of the probabilities of individual processes. For example, what is the probability that we're creating a Higgs boson? And so this is something we call matrix elements. And then we can kind of go on and see, okay, once we are creating particles, most of them are decaying right away. And so there's something called the Parton-Chow, where those particles decay and those decay products also decay and so on. And there's kind of like a cascading mechanism where there are lots of particles being created in the process, just because other particles are starting to decay and their lifetimes are short. And then later on, once kind of this cascade has finished, then actually the final particles are going to interact with our detector. And so this is also a very, very highly stochastic process where then even more secondary particles are being created. And this is actually then in the end what we're actually measuring in terms of voltages and so on in our detector. And so what's really nice about fundamental particle physics is that we can do all of these calculations because we have a lot of domain knowledge, and so we know what these individual probabilities are to a large extent, and this allows us to bridge this big gap. But you'll have seen that starting from very few particles, we generated millions of particles that are actually causing voltage spikes in our detector, and so the dimensionality of the data has completely exploded, and so that's one of the issues. And so one of the problems is that while we can kind of very nicely explain what the history or like a possible history from these high energy scales to the low energy scales could be, this is not something we observe. We only observe the final outcome. And so unfortunately, really what happens is we need to integrate over all possible histories that we could have walked down from these high energy scales to the low energy scales. And so while we do have our domain knowledge and we can compute these probabilities kind of there in the integrand, really the probability of, what is the probability of observing one particular set of data given some, core theory parameters is completely intractable, because we would need to average basically over all possible paths how we could have walked over these multiple orders of magnitudes in energy scale. And so this is an integral that is in millions of dimensions, then it's just hopeless to compute. And so in the end, we cannot do Bayes' theorem and kind of do standard statistical inference that requires a likelihood. And so sometimes it's also called a likelihood-free problem. And so this is then kind of what our data generating process is. So we cannot compute what the likelihood is. But what's kind of interesting is that while we don't know how to compute the probability, we can really sample very easily from it. And so like a probability model or like a stochastic forward model, there's always two things at once. And so in a sense, it's something where there's a probability attached to it, so like a number. But then there's also, in some sense, it's like a data generating mechanism or like a sampling process. And so while the number is difficult to compute, the sampling process is very easy to do because we can basically, pour all of our physics knowledge into software, and we can write these stochastic simulators that basically, simulate all of these different decays and so on as we're walking through these energy scales one by one. And so we have like a highly stochastic and also, and this is important, kind of like a highly branching simulator. So we have these stochastic branchings where particles decay into multiple decay products, and then those decay products also decay into multiple decay products. And so you can see kind of this increase in dimensionality that is kind of exponential as you're going through the simulator. But it's not a problem because we can just write the simulator that does this for us. And so in physics, then we have a very broad set of simulators that have been written over multiple decades. So we have, the MADGRAPH, which is computing the core matrix elements, which was implemented in, or it's written in Fortran to a large degree. Then we have these showering simulators that are a different piece of software. It's often written in C++ or sometimes also in Fortran, the older versions. And then the interaction of individual particles with the detector material is also C++. And so for each of these phases, we have like the right simulator, and then we kind of write like a complicated pipeline that goes from one simulator to the next, and we are passing on the data as we're going. But in the end, we can basically, think of it as a, a sampling process or data generating process that is just giving us samples. And so that's very nice. And so we can generate data, for any theory that we're interested in. And so then you can imagine that, okay, if we can generate data, we can try to figure out how to compare this to the actual data that we're observing in the experiment. So these software, these simulators are very, very nice, but they're also very, very expensive. And so you can see on the left-hand side, these simulators are correctly describing many, many orders of magnitudes of densities inside of the experiment. And so here, it's a particular projection of this high-dimensional data space. You can see the density is spanning multiple dimensions, and it's very well described by the simulator, which is the filled histogram. But the single forward pass, just simulating a single particle or a single event going through the detector, so that takes an order of minutes, depending on whether or not you do like a full fidelity simulation or not. And because we're taking data at 25 nanoseconds, we need many, many millions of events of simulated data in order to match the statistics that we have with the real detector. And so the computational overhead in these simulations is very, very large. And so this is a problem that, especially as we're going forward and the way that the hardware is developing, is a problem for us. Okay, so these raw samples, so while it's nice that we can basically simulate any type of theory and we get this 100 million dimensional output sample, and then we have millions of these events. These raw samples are completely useless for physics analysis. You cannot look at the image at the left and kind of really understand what is happening if you just look at kind of the voltages and so on. And so really what is one of the main pieces of work in particle physics is to find useful data representation. So in the language of machine learning, it's all about representation learning. So the question is, can we represent the data in a way that allows us to do inference in a kind of like in a physics way? And so the answer is yes. And so people usually kind of originally use a lot of physics intuition to figure out what these data representations should be. And so on the right-hand side, you see a very nice example of that from the Higgs discovery, where basically we had a map from 100 million numbers into a single number. And this, is enough to even visually see that there's kind of like an anomaly that can only be described by this blue component in the histograms, which is the Higgs boson. And so really kind of, what we're doing, what we call as physicists, physics analysis, as a machine learning person, you might kind of interpret this as basically like a exercise in dimensionality reduction and figuring out, how can you represent the data where you're losing a lot of the noise that you're not interested in, but you're keeping as much information from the physics as you can. And so just to see how this is going, so this is what we call data reconstruction. And the same way that we have our simulator and software, our reconstruction is also all implemented in software, of course. And so it starts kind of at the very low, very close to the detector output, where we have low-level features like trajectories of individual particles, and we have thousands of particles in there. So this is something we call tracking, and then we have clustering of energies. So the particles get stopped in the detector, and then they leave traces of energies there, and so we're clustering that. And then once we have tracks and clusters, we can do something like object reconstruction. We can figure out, okay, there's a particle that flew in this direction, then it was stopped in the detector. And then we do a lot of like what's called agglomerative clustering. So in physics, we would call it jet clustering. And it's all about, associating multiple energy depositions in the detector together and kind of thinking of it as a single particle. And then once we have these kind of low-level and mid-level features, we can even do lower dimensional data representations and really go back to the core physics that we're interested in. It's often about, angles of individual particles, or once you go to the final statistical analysis, you are kind of in the world of test statistics that then underpin your p-value or final statistical result. And so it's all, as you can see, it's also very hierarchical, and it's a kind of iterative process. And but from a data science vantage point, it's kind of all about pattern matching, data representations, approximate inference. We're trying to figure out, okay, what could be like the, what could have happened when we were actually going forward in the simulator. And so all of this is done is based on samples, and we don't know which data representation is the best a priori. There's no kind of known solution. And so this starts to look or sound a lot like machine learning, right? So it's all about like finding data representations based on samples that you get from somewhere, in our case from a simulator. And so this is really kind of the core tenet of machine learning, especially deep learning, this hierarchical level, these hierarchical levels of representations of data. And so that's why machine learning is really, really kind of a good match for particle physics. So then the target of this reconstruction process is, we want to approximately, so all of this kind of branching that is happening in the forward process, in some ways it's hiding the actual information that what was happening originally. And so what we're trying to do is in some ways to approximately invert this branching process. And so the inversion of branching is hierarchical clustering. So we're clustering multiple particles together. We say, okay, these were maybe the decay products of the Higgs. And then, then we put those things together, and then we interpret the sum of all of these different momenta that maybe went into different directions as the Higgs boson. And so we can do a lot of this hierarchical clustering. So the jet clustering is one version of it, but in the end, you can think of essentially every reconstruction process in particle physics as a type of clustering process. And then the question is, okay, these clustering processes are somehow driven or parameterized by certain choices in your reconstruction software. And then the question, what we're asking ourselves when we write this reconstruction software, okay, what parameters allow us to do run a clustering that is, as optimal as possible in order to extract the most physics that we can. And so what's kind of interesting is that these intermediate representations, they're not only kind of like a means to an end to get to the final fully clustered thing, but they're very important for interpretability and, to figure out, okay, what was the story of the data, as it was going through the forward process. And so we kind of, tell ourselves a story, what happened in the event. And it's not just about figuring out, okay, there was originally a Higgs boson there. We want to know, okay, how did the Higgs decay and so on. And so all of these intermediate states are important and allow us to trust the inference result. And so basically what we have in physics now, using this explanation, is we have like a kind of generating or data generating process that goes from a very high level of abstraction to a very low level of data. So, we go from the theory to the individual voltages. And then in the other way, what we call reconstruction is basically going from very, very low level raw data back to this high level of abstraction, like in the language of the theory, where we can basically almost read off the theory parameters from the reconstructed data representations. And so this is very similar to how machine learning works. It's, in machine learning, if you look, for example, at natural language processes, you have, these machine learning systems that go from a very high level of abstraction, maybe natural language, and generate very low level data like pixels. And so this is kind of these conditional image generating models. And then you can also do things like captioning, where you go from the raw pixel data back to this very high level of abstraction. And so you can see that there's a very close analogy between how kind of particle physics works and how machine learning works. And that's why we expect or we know and see kind of in our work that there's a very close connection and very well aligned. Okay, so this is basically then what leads us to the title of the seminar series. So this is where physics meets machine learning. So Heinrich physics, I think, is one area where there's a very good alignment. And because at the core, you can phrase particle physics as likelihood-free variational inference. And then if you're a machine learning person, these words will mean something to you. And it's all about finding, doing approximate inference, figuring out what happened based on raw data by doing some kind of optimization. And so there are two key issues that we need to somehow solve in our field. So that I told you we have like this accurate but very expensive simulator. And so here we really face kind of like an acceleration problem. So we don't expect that the machine learning will provide us a better simulator because we poured all of our physics knowledge into the simulator. So it's unlikely that the machine learning model will maybe create a better simulator, but maybe we can use machine learning to make it faster, especially because most of the new hardware is kind of based on running machine learning models. And so even by just translating it to a new hardware using machine learning, maybe that's also something where we can win. And then there's the second issue where basically all of this reconstruction, figuring out, okay, what is the right set of parameters that drives this hierarchical clustering to get the right data representations. This is essentially an optimization problem. So this is what we mean with variational inference. We want to search through a space of possible reconstruction algorithms and find the best algorithm. And what are the best data representations that allow us to do our physics? And so we don't know, because we don't know what the likelihood is. We don't know, how to formulate this, and so we need to look for it. And this is, looking in high-dimensional spaces is something machine learning can do very well. Okay, so then the question, okay, if you're like a pure machine learning person, the first question is, okay, well, you kind of formulated your problem in a way that is super aligned to machine learning. Why don't you just stick everything into a machine learning, a model, and then, you have like the raw voltage data and then outcomes, whether or not there's like a Higgs. And so I mentioned we're interested also kind of in interpretability and, giving like an explanation of the data and not just like a raw prediction. But at the same time, also, we don't think like this type of pipeline where you go directly from the hits to, whether or not it's a Higgs particle is currently feasible. So our understanding of, the current capabilities of machine learning is that just, training on the raw data is not going to work. Machine learning is developing very quickly, so maybe we'll be surprised, but I think this is kind of like a shared assumption between particle physicists, even the ones that are very enthusiastic about machine learning. And so really what we expect is that this is not going to work without a healthy dose of physics that we can inject into the machine learning model. And so then the question is, okay, where do you inject the physics, right? And so if you have like a standard machine learning model, you have your algorithm, which takes some inputs to some outputs. It's parameterized by something. By some parameters. So this might be the weights and biases of your neural network, or if you're kind of more in this differentiable programming world, might be just random parameters of your family of functions that you're trying to optimize. And then, so this goes from input to output, and then your task, in order to provide feedback to the learning mechanism, you need to evaluate the output and then compare it to some objective that you have. So, how well are you at predicting some things, and then you do this evaluation usually using some kind of feedback in this sense of supervised learning. And so you have like the model and the loss function, and then some of the labels and they're all different pieces in this machine learning cycle. And so actually, it turns out you can inject physics at each of these steps. And what's interesting is that gradient information and differentiable programming is playing a role in each of these models in order to do, inject physics domain knowledge into your machine learning setup. And so I'll kind of go through each of these and see how far I get. Then the kind of obvious thing is, okay, if you're looking for an algorithm, maybe you want to have a physics-inspired algorithm. And so you want to put the physics into your family of functions that you're looking through. And so that's very natural. At least for a physicist, for a machine learning person, you might make an argument about universal function approximation and so on. And then you might say, okay, well, I just have like a big black box of machine learning. If I have enough data, I'll be able to learn everything. So basically, this is the story of inductive bias. Smartly constraining the search space or the family of functions that you even allow as a possible solution. And as physicists, I think we're very, very married to this idea of inductive bias. What we like to think is that hard coding certain structure that we absolutely know is needs to be satisfied allows us or allows the machine learning process to not try to learn these things from scratch, but they're hard coded in the structure of the model, and then you have a much higher data efficiency in your training. And by constraining the solution space, I think we also add a lot of interpretability because we kind of constrain the solution to something that, for example, respects the symmetry. And then, we can, connect us more to our physics intuition. Selfishly, I think it makes us physicists feel like we contribute something. If we already kind of pass it on to machine learning, at least we're able to kind of tell the machine what to look for. But what's important here is that whatever modification you're doing to the network, you need to keep the differentiability in order to allow gradient descent, which is the primary way to train deep learning systems nowadays, in order to keep gradient descent working. And so you start maybe with some vague, very large function class, but you add structure to it in order to gain data efficiency, and then you will have a much steeper learning curve in order to get to a good performance. But you need to you start from something super differentiable, but you add structure. Then what kind of structure are we adding? And so this is basically your vanilla bouquet of different neural network architecture. They're all about kind of adding different kinds of inductive bias. So this is a famous slide from Michael Bronstein about the kind of zoo of different neural network architecture. And really all of these things are neural networks, and so it's clear that the architecture itself is not the thing that differentiates something to be a neural network, but it's really the thing that it's a differentiable family of functions, and they all have this in common. And so really the common thread between all of these different things is that they're differentiable families of functions that are efficiently trainable. But then depending on what inductive bias you want, you can basically add it's you can choose which architecture you want. And so these are kind of vanilla types of inductive bias, but of course as physicists we like to add our own. And so like over the last years, you've seen a very wide array of different differentiable or at least like ways to add structure to the neural network without breaking differentiability. And so you have so this is typically like some static information about the solution space that like some symmetry. And so you have things like equivariant normalizing flows for kind of lattice QCD. You have things that really kind of encode, like in a way, like a recurrent neural network, the tree-like structure of the type of hierarchical clustering that we're doing. And particle physics, of course, Lorentz invariance is important for us. And there are things like gauge equivariant convolutional neural networks. And so there's just a super wide array of possible symmetries and inductive biases that you can add into the neural network architecture. And that's a very kind of active field. But then there's kind of like the other view that you can also take. So instead of starting from like a neural network and saying, okay, I don't want this very large neural network, which has like all kinds of functions, and now I'm adding constraints while keeping everything differentiable, like the basic neural network, is. You could also kind of take the other way around. Okay, if you want to, arrive at a physics neural network, so you can either go from a neural network and add physics, or you can go from some physics family of functions or programs and add differentiability so that you can basically train them the same way that neural networks are trained. And so by just adding this idea of differentiability to standard physics code, in some sense, you're turning that physics code into something that at least you can build into a neural network, something like a layer. And so you might have some vague, upstream machine learning component. Then there's maybe some section that is very domain specific, and then some downstream machine learning component. But because everything is differentiable, because you added the differentiability to the domain software, you can still go, back propagate and do gradient descent without any problem. And so what's different in this view is that not only are we thinking about the kind of static symmetries, but we're somehow also considering, okay, what type of dynamics does our physics imply, right? So our physics code, usually it's about like data transformation. You go from some initial state to some final state. And so this is usually described by some kind of physics. And if we make this differentiable, basically, we're not only kind of thinking about symmetries like energy conservation, but really kind of much more detailed physics information. And so this is this direction that leads you towards differentiable programming. And so the way that you would do this is then using these machine learning frameworks mostly as a programming language. So you kind of ignore the machine learning part. And so for TensorFlow and PyTorch, which are more kind of machine learning frameworks, you need to ignore like a large section. So they're really kind of designed to be for standard neural networks. But one of the more recent frameworks like JAX really takes this point very seriously, that it's really more like a programming language that is differentiable. And then, okay, if you do want to implement neural networks on top of a differentiable programming language, you can do it, but it's not actually a core part of the language in JAX. And so this is kind of like a shift that is happening in the machine learning world, that you go from like deep learning libraries more to like differentiable programming libraries. And so basically what these differentiable programming libraries give you is, you take some kind of program that has some inputs and outputs. But now when you run the program, not only do you get the output, but you also get the gradient. And it's not a kind of approximation of the gradient, but it's really like an exact, to machine precision, an exact gradient. And so this is now something that is really happening across many, many science domains. So you have things like in computer vision, you have machine learning systems that have various like standard machine learning components, but then some domain specific operation in the middle. You have things like in fluid dynamics. That's something that is happening also in Munich on having partial differential equation solvers inside of a differentiable end-to-end system. In statistical physics, you have differentiable programming for protein simulation. You have differentiable programming, and you can just see that this is kind of happening across the different sciences. And I think scientists really like this idea of adding their domain knowledge somehow into this machine learning component. And even though this idea of automatic differentiation is very old, I think what makes it interesting now is that you have this capability to mix machine learning components, which are super over parameterized, with much more constrained physics components. And so this mixture, so just having kind of raw differentiable physics is maybe not so interesting, but being able to mix and match freely physics with kind of more over parameterized machine learning blocks, I think that combination is what makes it interesting. And so, of course, we're also interested in high-energy physics. So now if it's happening in all these different sciences, of course, we're also interested to see whether or not this can be useful for us, because, as we said, we are fairly aligned with machine learning. So the hope is that we can somehow make use of this. And so there's a lot of kind of early activity to, make common types of computations that we have in high-energy physics differentiable and see, okay, what can we do with it once it is differentiable. And so I'm just flashing a few projects kind of across the field, some of which I am involved in. So we have differentiable programming for describing the structure of the proton. We have differentiable programming for doing like the core matrix element calculation, which is the probability of like the first type of interaction that is happening when you're, for example, creating a Higgs boson. There's more like a probabilistic programming in terms of like the showering process, and so I'll get to this. On the reconstruction, so this is on the simulation side, and then on the reconstruction side, you have trackings where gradients are useful to do error propagation. We have statistical models that are differentiable. And then the final inference that is also kind of end-to-end differentiable. And I do want to point out that Sven has a nice package just I think from last week on like string theory, also in the differentiable programming using JAX. And but it's so far away from even my diagram where you start from some high energy, so I didn't even know where to put it, but I think it's very interesting that basically across the entire spectrum from string theory to like the core tracking, you somehow see differentiable programming popping up everywhere. But so the question is, okay, can you actually do something useful for it? And so there are like some interesting early results that at least indicate that we could do something interesting with it. And so most of this kind of happens by putting not only kind of the model in a differentiable way, but you actually adjust the evaluation function, and so you use the dynamics of the physics to judge the output of some machine learning model. And so I just wanted to flash a few examples here. And so the idea is that okay, instead of using kind of like a standard machine learning loss like binary cross entropy or mean square error or something like this, and to do like your standard regression or classification task, basically the way that you judge the model is by taking the output and running it through some more domain physics, right? And so then what comes out after you run it through physics is maybe something that has some more physics, some more physics sense, and that will be our objective. And so instead of just formulating our objectives in the way kind of in the language of statistics, we get to formulate our objective in the language of physics, and then we can basically back propagate, but it requires basically both the a model and the kind of evaluation function, which is now maybe some complicated physics code, to be differentiable in order to not break the gradient propagation throughout the system. And so one example of this is training fast simulators. As I said, one of the big questions that we're trying to answer in the future is how to accelerate our simulation pipeline. Also, if you want to do machine learning, you want to have a lot of samples, and just having fast simulators is important for this. And so one of the core things that a simulator should be doing is that it should generate the right events at the right relative proportions, right? And so that's kind of like the basic thing that it's supposed to be doing. And so what's kind of interesting is that we know from very first principles what the relative proportions of these events should be, because this is exactly what Feynman derived with his Feynman diagrams. So we can compute these so-called matrix elements as what the relative proportions should be. And so somehow we can basically instead of trying some more generative model linked type of training, what we can do is we can basically take a generative model for machine learning that might not actually have a lot of kind of symmetries encoded in it, but the way that we provide physics feedback is that we look at the events this model is generating, and we just match it or compare it to the relative proportions that the matrix element calculation is telling us what it should be, and then we can formulate it statistically, in a way that is differentiable, and then we can backpropagate a signal to the parameters if the proportions are slightly off, and we can adjust the parameters in order to improve them. And so this goes through training normalizing flows, for example, with reverse KL divergence. And so it's a slightly different way than how you would normally train normalizing flow. And the physics basically arrives more by evaluating matrix elements or physics domain code instead of comparing maybe through to actual samples that you get from some other simulator. Okay, so then what does this look like? So one of the things that I'm involved in together with my colleague Michael Kagan is basically the core package that is responsible for doing these matrix elements calculations called MatGraph. As I said, it was originally implemented in the Fortran. And so the way that we managed to make it differentiable is that we basically transpiled it into a differentiable programming language. In this case, it's JAX. And so that's why we call this project MatJax. And so now that we have it in a differentiable programming language, we can use this function as an evaluation or loss function during the training. And so MatJax basically gives us these unnormalized probabilities and like various types of gradients. And so what we can see on the right-hand side in the plot is that we get much kind of nicer match to the actual relative proportions than if we would train it, for example, with a standard normalizing flow. And so this greatly increases the sample efficiency. And if we are more sample efficient, we can generate more, more events more quickly. And so this helps us generally in our high-energy physics workflow. Okay, so then
can I ask you a bit on? Sorry, can I ask you a question on that?
Sure.
So how many kind of phase-space parameters are we having here, and like roughly like how many theory parameters is kind of
so here basically, so what's interesting, so basically so in the standard model, I think whatever you have like some kind of 25 free parameters, and then you have lots of secondary computed parameters. And so you can get the gradients with respect to any parameter. So if you want to have the gradient with respect to the whatever Fermi constant, or you want to have the parameter with respect to some particle mass, you can get this without any problem. So any parameter that's in your MatGraph card, you can get the gradient with respect to the phase space dimensionality. So this example is TT bar. I think it's a 16-dimensional phase space, but it can go higher. What is kind of interesting with JAX is just the compilation became very, very slow. And so I'll get to this, that maybe actually using JAX for this is not the greatest idea. And so, but it's like the easiest way to get something differentiable by just rewriting it in JAX, so to say. And what we exploited is that MatGraph itself is like a code generator. And so tuning it to just generate not only Fortran and C++, but also JAX was not the most difficult operation.
I see. And so because you say you're comparing with efficiency, effectively comparing with normalizing flows, do you see that adding more or less additional physics constraints really gives you much more performance? So would you max out things, or is it just a few are already sufficient kind of thing?
So what's interesting, so if your goal is to train a simulator, and in order to train, so in the normal normalizing flow, the way you train the flow, you need to have samples already from your target distribution, right? And so somehow it's like a chicken and egg problem, where if you already have like ways to get a lot of training samples in order to train your normalizing flow, like clearly maybe you don't need a faster version of the simulator, right? And so what's nice in like this reverse KL training, like this other way of training normalizing flows, that it doesn't need any samples from the true simulator, because the physics is kind of in this unnormalized density. And so the location of the physics changes, and then you basically don't need any samples, and that's much more sample efficient. Yeah, so feel free to, so I don't see kind of the audience, but feel free to interrupt me whenever. So the other example, which is also kind of like a nice historical accident or so, is like the proton structure. So as you might know, okay, we don't understand the structure of the proton from first principles to a large degree. And so one of the early pioneering use cases of neural networks and highly parameterized functions was to describe the proton in this basically non-parametric or highly parametric way. Yeah, so there's like no formula how the proton could be described. And so there was like a neural network, but the way to figure out what the right weights and biases for this neural network would be is you can only figure it out once you run the this initial state, which is described by the neural network through some differential equations, and then later on you match it to some experimental data and so on. And so that was, even though it's kind of described by neural networks, it was trained using genetic algorithms. So I shouldn't say generic, but genetic. And so that's kind of interesting. You have a neural network, but you trained it using something where, you know, nobody would think of training a neural network with genetic algorithms. But the problem was that there was like no differentiable way to, you know, back propagate the signal on how good this initial state is back through the solving of the PDF and the parameters. And so recently there was a nice work that basically, you know, rewrote the ODE solution in TensorFlow, and this enabled to do back propagation. And finally, we can basically train one of the pioneering or, you know, important use cases of neural networks in nuclear physics using the way that you should be training neural networks, which is gradient descent. And so there were some nice words on the advantages on differentiable programming and so on in the paper. And so you can check it out. So let me see, there's a question in the chat. Okay, so maybe, so isn't the transparency? Yeah, well, yeah, I guess that's true. So we don't start from the C++ code and transpile it, but we have a code generator. So, yeah, so I think that's a good comment. Thanks, Lukas. Okay, so let me see. Oops. Okay. So this is one use case of the differentiable programming where, I mean, there's lots of physics. So these are like the famous DGLAB equations that, you know, allow us to describe the proton at various energy scales. And, you know, back propagating through all of this is kind of like a very nice way to train, you know, what you learned, you know, what you know about the structure of the proton. And on the plot on the right-hand side, you can see that the training using gradient descent is much more stable than the training using a genetic algorithm. Okay, so like a similar idea where you basically go through a lot of physics once you have it like as a neural network is that you know, training uncertainty aware neural networks. And so this is really trying to optimize the internal data representation with respect to the actual physics goal that you have. And so this is including various assessments of systematic uncertainties and the final, you know, statistical analysis and so on. And so there are lots of steps, you know, once you've figured out, okay, how do you represent the data to finally saying, okay, what's the p-value of my measurement? There are lots of intermediate steps. And so one thing that we've done is to try to make all of these steps differentiable. And so then we can basically optimize the neural network to be, you know, provide us the best possible result in the language of physics, which is like a low p-value, for example. And so here we needed to back propagate through like density estimations, so histograms. We needed to back propagate through like a, you know, building like a full statistical model. We needed to back propagate through, you know, doing maximum likelihood fits, which is like an iterative process. So differentiating through like this, you know, like a root finding algorithm or like a fixed point, you know, function is also not something that is totally trivial, but it's possible. And so now we can basically expose the neural network to feedback that is very, very much downstream. And, you know, and the neural network will learn to, you know, do trade-offs that we also as physicists like to do. So on the left-hand side in the animation, so this is a toy example. So normally what we want to do is we want to have as little background as possible and as much signal as possible. And so that would be kind of on the right-hand side where the plot starts out. But you'll notice that at that end of the spectrum, it's true that you have little background and high signal, but at the same time, you also have a high background uncertainty. And so this will actually you know, give a worse result. And if you're, you know, doing some trade-off and we're saying, okay, I'll allow a bit more background, but I'll be in a regime where I have lower uncertainties. And so then by doing back propagation and evaluating the function based on this, you know, very long-winded way of evaluating the physics result, you know, the neural network will automatically, you know, roll towards a solution that does exactly this trade-off of allowing more background and in order to reduce the systematic uncertainties. Okay, so then you kind of see like an emerging pattern. So all of these early attempts in differentiable programming, they use kind of like the same strategy. And so you're picking some kind of target that's useful and kind of obviously differentiable. And now you're rewriting software whatever you picked as a target, you're rewriting it as a differentiable programming language. But this really won't scale to like a vision of a fully end-to-end optimizable high-energy physics pipeline. And so one of the things that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, and I don't have like all the answers yet, is okay, what. So first of all, should we have an end-to-end optimizable differentiable high-energy physics pipeline? And if yes, what would this look like? And so there are kind of two challenges that we have, and so that we need to overcome. And so that one of the things is that there's a technical challenge that a lot of our physics code is honed over many, many decades, and it's written in high performance languages like C, C++, Fortran, and so on, and it has millions of lines of code. And so there's like a core question: how do we make this differentiable, right? And so the answer cannot be we're rewriting everything in JAX. And so one of the answers that is now emerging, and also something that Lukas is involved in, is there's an emerging new generation of tools that is allows you to kind of do differentiable programming using kind of more general purpose languages like C++ or Fortran and so on. And so Enzyme is one of the nice packages that is really integrating the automatic differentiation into the compiler. And so any front-end language that is lowering down to LLVM IR is actually something that you can make differentiable. There's also a package that's more being developed in the high-energy physics community called CLAD. And but all of these things are, I think, really key components because I really personally can't see us rewriting everything in JAX, even though sometimes that's maybe also a way to clean up the code. But so this is a kind of formidable technical challenge, but it seems doable. There's a more conceptual challenge where kind of fundamentally, as I said originally, high-energy physics is kind of dominated by these two patterns. So it's the stochastic branching and then the iterated hierarchical clustering. And so both of these processes are fundamentally non-differentiable. And so you need to think about, okay, if you want to have something not like end-to-end differentiable, what could you do with this? And so there are multiple answers to this question, and the space is also developing quickly. So one of the early answers that people found is, okay, you can just replace parts of this simulation reconstruction pipeline with the machine learning. And so you can basically replaced with generative surrogates, so like a GAN or like a variation autoencoder or something like this, and basically you replace your simulator with the learned version of the simulator. So that's nice. They're kind of smoothly reparameterized, and so somehow like the strategy to make something differentiable is not only to rewrite it using differentiable programming, like the actual physics code, but you just replace it with the machine learning model. That's, of course, if you replace it with the machine learning model, of course, it becomes differentiable right away. And so this is nice, but it also loses precision and interpretability. So like all of the nice physics interpretation, you can look in what's happening during the simulation or reconstruction process. You lose all of this because we replaced it with a black box, but there's something that's doable. And maybe the more you can replace your pipeline with machine learning, the easier it is to make your pipeline differentiable, which might be an obvious statement to make. Then the second answer is that you can actually do gradient estimation on like this discrete stochastic graphs. And so this goes under the name of score function estimation and like something like reinforce, which is the core algorithm behind policy gradients and reinforcement learning and so on. And there are like various ways to get control over the gradients. So these methods are provide you an unbiased estimate of the expectation value of something that maybe uses discrete numbers, which is totally fine for us. We want to maybe get the best expected reconstruction. And so this gives you an unbiased estimators, but it has very high variance. And so you need to play a lot of tricks to get useful gradients so that actually learning can proceed nicely. And a secondary thing that you need to keep in mind is that in order to do the score function estimation, you need to actually be able to compute the score, which is also not something that we are usually able to do in our simulators. So we think of it as stochastic programs, and we don't usually think of them as probabilistic programs in the sense that you can, for every run of the program, you know what the probability of this particular execution path was. But in order to do these types of unbiased gradient estimations for these discrete choices, you would need to somehow rewrite your code not as a differentiable program, but as a probabilistic program. And that might not be much easier, but it's at least something that goes around this conceptual problem of gradient estimation with these discrete choices and highly branching processes. And so here's an example of this in action. And so one of the nice or kind of more out there ideas is whether or not we could use machine learning for kind of designing hardware for future detectors. And so on the left-hand side, you see something from the machine learning side where it's all about, okay, what should be the shape of this green surface in order to have the water hit the purple line or dots. And so you can imagine you have like a highly parameterized version of the surface. You don't know exactly what the shape should be, but it's basically something you can learn by running the water simulation basically forward and running it through some physics. And on the right-hand side, you can see we're doing the same thing for these highly branching stochastic processes that you see on the top right. And so here, basically, the idea is, okay, where should we put the detector material in order to stop the shower at some certain distance? And so you can do this with score function estimation. It provides very noisy gradients, but in the end, it works. And so that's kind of nice. It's a very kind of early example of this. But in order to do this more seriously, basically, what you need to do is you need to do the same kind of trick that you have in differentiable programming of, enabling general purpose simulators to become differentiable. You need to also enable general purpose stochastic programs to be kind of probabilistic programs in the sense of probabilistic programming. And so there's various works that we're doing in order to try to integrate probabilistic programming with state-of-the-art physics simulations, both with this PyProp project and also together with Lukas, we're working on integrating probabilistic programming into Enzyme. And then the hope is that we can do the same type of magic trick, that we can integrate the probabilistic programming on the compiler level so that you don't need to think about it at a higher abstraction level that you might be coding in. Okay, so then the third version would be, okay, you can somehow, if it's, the problem is like the discrete operations, you can have like a relaxed set of operations. And so there are various tricks to do like relaxed or, sorting and ranking. And so you basically have like soft versions of all of these different things. And, what we're thinking about is like, what is it, like a soft histogram, for example? And so we're kind of collecting the right set of primitives on GitHub of, what kind of soft things do we need to have in order to, get an end-to-end physics pipeline. My personal opinion is that while, replacing something hard with something kind of soft is doable for like specific choices, I don't think it's going to be the path to get like an end-to-end differentiable or a gradient estimate for your entire pipeline. And so I think it's maybe one ingredient, but it will not solve the entire problem, because very often we want to have actually the hard choice, because sometimes you don't, like the intermediate choice is not something that is like a good solution. For example, if you're like driving on the road, you either drive on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side. You don't want to drive in the middle. Okay, so then, one important question is, are these gradients enough? And so, if we have gradients, will we actually be able to efficiently end-to-end optimize? So it's not only that deep neural networks are just differentiable programming. So lots of tricks in deep neural networks that made it possible to train them, and, initialization, skip connections, highly over-parameterized models. And so it's not even obvious that even if you had like a totally differentiable end-to-end pipeline, whether or not it would the structure of the loss landscape is such that you would learn efficiently. And so one possible solution here might be to make the machine learning blocks in this entire pipeline so large, not only to make it differentiable, but also because it adds a lot of over parameterization that allows the pipeline to learn more efficiently, because it starts to look more and more like a big machine learning model instead of a lot of physics code that is maybe differentiable here and there. Okay, so I'm looking at the time, so I'll try to wrap up. Basically, then the secondary question is, okay, if we have like an end-to-end differentiable model, how much better could we even be? So I think it's also something that we don't know. So right now, of course, we have a lot of different machine learning components in our pipeline, and we currently optimize each of them individually, kind of in a greedy way. And what's interesting, this is how also deep networks were trained, 15 or 20 years ago, where, you train like each layer individually. And we are training like a tracking machine learning model, like a calorimeter machine learning model, and so on individually. And then we put them all together into some big pipeline. That might not be differentiable, but it works. And so it's somehow optimized, right? And so what we don't know is what is the distance between what you can get using this greedy optimization and what you would get with an end-to-end optimization. And so there are kind of these three aspects. You have like this greedy machine learning plus physics. This is what we're doing right now. You have like this vision of end-to-end differentiable physics. And then as a machine learning person, you might have like this end-to-end black box. And so what we don't know is really what the hierarchy between these three versions of being able to optimize your analysis pipeline, who is kind of getting out on top. And so this is something that is an open question, and which what we're trying to figure out. Okay, so I'll skip over this, or maybe just one version. So there's also a way to use gradients in the labels. So you just give up on this notion of doing like a end-to-end differentiable optimization of the pipeline, but you can still use gradients efficiently in simulation-based inference, where kind of the gradient is more on the label side. And so kind of having gradients of noisy tractable quantities allows you to get like a very nice label set for training intractable quantities, like the likelihood ratio, which is something that you would want to do. I'm happy to chat offline about this. I'll skip over this, but it's just a way to become much more data efficient. And so I just wanted to say you can still use gradients also on the label side. And so this brings me to my summary. So basically, what I wanted to show is that so gradient information somehow improves our ability to inject physics in different ways. So you can inject physics by finding ways to add inductive bias in a differentiable way to your model. You can exploit the simulators and have like gradients extracted from the simulator to get better labels. And what we discussed at length is that you can use differentiable loss functions to kind of judge the output of a model on physics goals. And so there's lots of increasing interest in high-energy physics, but it's a fairly new field. And so there are a few fundamental questions that I touched on that still need to be worked out. And for this, we'll have a nice conference next year in June, and also a 3-day mini conference on differentiable and probabilistic programming in Munich. So the workshop is full, but you'll still be able to register for the 3-day mini conference if you're interested. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lukas, for this very interesting talk. Are there questions? Right. So yeah, let me ask one question. In terms of when you have the simulation, the reconstruction pipe, directions essentially, somehow, is there a way of generating a kind of connection at various stages between the two? And or maybe creating circles in there? I mean, this very much looks like, you could ask questions.
Yeah. So basically, I think what you're asking, so because it's like this parabola shaped thing, like of course the Parton shower is somehow very closely connected to the jet algorithm, and energy clusters are closely connected to hadronization models and so on. But yeah, so this is something that we're trying to, or like people are looking. In some ways, the way that we kind of do our greedy optimization right now is basically we start learning. So the left-hand side, the simulation, because it's the true latent state, is going to be our label, and the way we train our tracking is to use the same level of abstraction on the simulation side. We use this as labels, and then we basically train the lowest level, then we train the next level, and so on, and then we basically train all the way to the top. And so this is kind of this greedy optimization that we're doing now. Whether or not you can somehow integrate these labels and this correlation even in the non-greedy way, I think it's an interesting problem. And so lots of people are kind of trying to figure out whether or not that would be the case. So yeah, so it's a good point. Yeah.
Thanks. More questions? I cannot see any more. So let's thank
Fine.
Lukas again for a very nice talk. Stop.
Okay, thank you. Happy to discuss